Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something that's both kind of cool and a little scary at the same time. We're going to be talking about how social media is actually rewiring our brains.
Yeah.
We all use it. It's obviously completely revolutionized the way we connect with each other and get information. But there's more and more research coming out that's showing us how it's affecting us psychologically
Right.
and even neurologically.
Yeah.
And I think, the people that listen to the show are really interested in this kind of stuff. You want to get like the quick version, but still get the whole picture. And I got to say, just going through the research for this deep dive, some of the stuff we found is really, really surprising. So we're really lucky to have an expert with us today who's going to be able to help us connect the dots and explain not just what's happening, but also like why it matters. So,
Yeah, social media is really, it's tapping into some very basic parts of our brains.
yeah.
And it's really gone way beyond just, connecting with friends. It's really about how these platforms are designed to keep us coming back for more. Almost like an addiction.
Yeah, I saw that a lot in the research too, this idea of like the dopamine loop. And that really kind of got me thinking. So can you explain like what that is?
Sure, think of it this way. Social media platforms are like masters at hijacking our brain's reward system.
Okay.
Every time you get a notification, like a comment, it's like a little slot machines going off in your brain.
Uh-huh.
And you get this surge of dopamine, which is the chemical that makes us feel good.
Right.
And the more we get those rewards, the more we crave them.
So it's not just about connecting with people, it's about chasing that good feeling.
Exactly. It creates this feedback loop that could be very similar to what we see in gambling or substance addiction.
Wow.
The need for that next dopamine hit keeps you coming back for more, even if you know it's not really good for you in the long run.
Right. So that's where it gets a little scary, right? Like, what are some of the consequences of being stuck in this loop?
Well, one of the biggest issues is it can really mess with our attention spans.
Yeah.
We become so used to getting those quick hits of dopamine that anything that requires sustained effort,
Okay.
like reading a long article or having a deep conversation, starts to feel boring or even difficult.
Yeah, it's like we're training our brains to crave distractions instead of focus, right?
Precisely. There was a study by Firth and his colleagues in 2019
Okay.
that found this constant stimulation from social media actually makes it harder for us to concentrate on tasks that don't offer those immediate rewards.
Mm-hmm.
So imagine trying to really get into a complex book while your phone is buzzing with notifications. It's like trying to appreciate a gourmet meal when someone's blasting loud commercials in the background.
So what can we do about it? I mean, we
Bah.
can't just ditch social media entirely, can we?
No, and we shouldn't. Social media does have its benefits,
Mm-hmm.
but it's crucial to be aware of this dopamine loop and to take steps to kind of break free from it.
Okay.
One thing you can try is something called dopamine detoxing, where you intentionally take breaks from social media to let your brain reset.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be this huge thing. Even just putting your phone away for a few hours can make a difference.
Yeah, I've tried that, and it's crazy how much calmer I feel when I'm not constantly checking my phone. It's like my brain finally has a chance to breathe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's also about being more intentional with your social media use.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of just mindlessly scrolling, set specific time limits for yourself.
Okay.
Curate your feed to follow accounts that actually bring you value.
Mm.
And pay attention to how you're feeling while you're using those platforms.
So it's about taking back control instead of letting the algorithms run our lives.
Remember, you have the power to shape your online experience.
Okay, so we've talked about this dopamine dilemma, but there's this other side to social media that I find really interesting and honestly maybe a little unsettling. It's this idea of the social comparison trap. I know I'm not the only one who scrolls through Instagram and feels like a little twinge of envy. Seeing everyone's perfect curated lives.
Oh yeah, this is a huge issue.
Mhm.
Social media often presents this very distorted view of reality. People tend to showcase their highlight reels,
Right.
vacations, promotions, perfect bodies. But it's important to remember that what we see online is rarely the full picture. We're comparing our behind the scenes to everyone else's highlight reel. And that's never going to feel good.
Right. It's like everyone else is living their best life and I'm just, stuck at home
Yeah.
in my sweatpants with a pile of laundry.
That's where the psychological effects start to kick in.
Hmm.
Research has shown a clear link between heavy social media use and increased rates of anxiety and depression. There was one study by Twenge and her colleagues back in 2018
Okay.
that really drove this point home.
Yeah, it makes sense. When you're constantly bombarded with images of people who seem to have it all, it's easy to start feeling like you're not good enough.
And then there's FOMO, the fear of missing out. You see everyone else having fun traveling, achieving their goals.
Yeah.
And it creates this sense of urgency and anxiety that you need to be doing more,
Right.
experiencing more, being more.
It's exhausting. So how do we escape this trap? I mean, social media isn't going to disappear anytime soon.
True. It's about recognizing the trap and being proactive about mitigating its effects.
Okay.
One thing you can do is be really mindful of who you're following. Unfollow accounts that make you feel bad about yourself, and instead focus on following people who are authentic and promote positivity.
Yeah, I've actually started doing that, and it's been amazing. It's so refreshing to see people embracing their imperfections and celebrating real life.
Another crucial step is to simply reduce your overall screen time. The more time you spend in the real world interacting with people face to face, the less power these online comparisons will have over you.
Yeah, it's about remembering that real life is happening outside of that little screen.
Right.
Speaking of real life, has anyone else noticed how much harder it is to remember things these days? I used to be able to memorize phone numbers, birthdays, all sorts of stuff. Now I can't even remember what I had for breakfast without checking my Instagram story.
You're not alone. There's this growing body of research on what's been called digital amnesia. It's this idea that our reliance on technology, our smartphones, Google social media, is actually making our own memory weaker.
So we're basically outsourcing our brains to Google. Like, why bother remembering something if I can just look it up?
Exactly. There was a fascinating study by Sparrow and his colleagues back in 2011 that showed they found that people were less likely to remember information if they knew they could easily access it online.
Wow.
And then there's the way social media itself is structured. This constant flood of short videos, memes, and tweets conditions our brains to process information in these tiny bits and pieces. We're always skimming and scrolling, which doesn't really allow for deep thinking or analysis.
Yeah, it's like our brains are being trained for superficiality, like we're losing the ability to really engage with complex ideas and hold on to information for the long term.
And that's a big concern because critical thinking is more important than ever in this age of information overload.
So are we doomed? Are we all just going to become like mindless zombies glued to our screens? Is there any hope?
Not at all. But we do need to be proactive about strengthening our cognitive abilities.
Okay.
One thing you can do is practice active learning.
Okay.
Engage with books, have discussions, challenge yourself with problem-solving activities. Anything that gets those brain cells firing.
Okay, so we need to exercise those brain muscles. What else can we do?
Limiting multitasking is key. Our brains aren't designed to effectively handle multiple streams of information at once. So when you're working on something, try to focus on that one task and minimize distractions as much as possible. And don't underestimate the power of digital detoxes. Taking regular breaks from technology, even for a few hours, can help your brain reset and recharge.
So we're talking about taking intentional breaks, being mindful of how we're using social media, and actively engaging our brains in other ways. It's like a whole brain approach to combating the negative effects of the digital world.
That's a great way to put it. It's all about finding balance and using technology to enhance our lives, not control them.
Okay, speaking of technology, I have a confession. I am totally guilty of scrolling through social media before bed. It's like my brain just can't resist. But I've heard that can really mess with your sleep. Is that true?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the main culprits is the blue light that our phones, tablets, and laptops emit. It suppresses the production of melatonin, which is the hormone that regulates our sleep-wake cycle.
So that's why I sometimes toss and turn for hours, even when I'm exhausted.
Right. The mental stimulation from social media keeps your brain in go mode when you're trying to switch to sleep mode. It's like telling your brain to hit the gas pedal and the brakes at the same time.
No wonder it gets confused. So it's not just the blue light, it's also the content itself that can keep us up at night.
Exactly. Consuming negative news or stressful content late at night can spike your cortisol levels, which is the stress hormone, making it even harder to relax and fall asleep.
So what can we do to protect our sleep? I've heard about setting a digital curfew, like putting away all screens an hour or two before bed. Is that realistic?
It is, and it's incredibly effective. That time before bed is crucial for letting your brain wind down.
Okay, I'm willing to try that. What about those blue light filters? Do they actually work?
They can definitely help. Most devices have features to reduce the amount of blue light they emit, like night shift. It's not a perfect solution, but it's a good step.
So it's about minimizing blue light, avoiding stimulating content, and giving our brains a chance to unplug and unwind.
Exactly.
Okay, this is all great information, but there's one more thing I want to talk about. Have you ever noticed how much more comfortable people are texting? than actually talking face-to-face.
Absolutely. It's a trend researchers have been noticing for a while now.
Hmm.
The concern is that our reliance on digital communication might actually be hurting our face-to-face communication skills.
Yeah, it's like we're forgetting how to have real conversations. I know I've been in situations where I felt awkward talking to someone in person, even though I can text them for hours with no problem.
There's a neurological explanation for this. Online communication lacks the nuance of face-to-face interaction. We don't get those subtle cues from facial expressions, tone of voice, body language.
Right.
So we miss out on practicing how to interpret social cues
Yeah.
and respond appropriately.
Yeah, it's like our emotional intelligence is taking a hit. We're becoming less adept at reading people and navigating social situations.
Right.
So how do we break free from this cycle? How do we rebuild those face-to-face communication skills that seem to be fading?
It takes conscious effort. The first step is to prioritize in-person interactions.
Okay.
Make a point of having conversations with people face-to-face, even if it feels a little uncomfortable at first.
Right, that makes sense. It's like anything else, the more you practice, the better you get.
Exactly. And when you're having those conversations, practice active listening.
Hmm.
Focus on understanding what the other person is saying, not just waiting for your turn to talk.
So put down the phone, make eye contact, and really listen.
Right.
But what about online communication? Is there any way to make that more meaningful and less superficial?
Absolutely. Instead of just scrolling and liking posts, engage in real conversations. Share your thoughts. Ask questions. Really connect with the people you're interacting with online.
So it's about being present and intentional. Whether we're interacting online or offline, it's about using technology to enhance our communication, not replace it.
Exactly. It's all about finding that balance.
Yeah, well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here in part one. We've explored how social media is affecting our brains in some pretty significant ways. From our dopamine levels and attention spans to our sleep patterns and communication skills. This is a lot to process.
It is. And it's important to remember that this is not about demonizing social media. It's about understanding its influence so we can use it more intentionally.
Exactly. So in the next part of our deep dive, we'll shift gears and focus on solutions. We'll look at some practical strategies you can use to create a healthier relationship with social media. Stay tuned. Welcome back. So far, we've really dug deep into the ways social media can affect our brains, even down to the level of our neurons and dopamine. It's pretty mind-blowing stuff. But, before we move on to what we can do about it, I'm curious, is there more to this idea that social media can physically change our brains?
There is. Our brains are incredibly adaptable, constantly rewiring themselves based on our experiences. And social media is definitely a new kind of experience that our brains are trying to make sense of.
It's like our brains evolved in a world without smartphones and endless feeds, and now they're playing catch-up, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's why it's so important to be aware of the potential consequences, both good and bad. Social media can be awesome for connecting with people, learning, and even making a difference in the world.
Right.
But it can also be a source of distraction, unhealthy comparisons, and anxiety if we're not careful.
So it's about finding that sweet spot, that balance, where we're using it to enhance our lives without letting it take over, right?
Absolutely. And that balance is going to be different for everyone. The key is to pay attention to how social media is affecting you personally, and then make changes based on what you notice.
That makes a lot of sense. One of the things that really stuck with me from the research was this idea that social media can actually change the physical structure of our brains. Is that really true?
It is. It all comes down to neuroplasticity.
Hmm.
The brain's amazing ability to change and adapt throughout our lives. Studies have shown that if we're repeatedly exposed to certain things, it can actually change the size and activity of different parts of our brains.
So if we're constantly scrolling through those feeds, getting those dopamine hits, comparing ourselves to others, our brains are physically changing to reflect that. It's kind of wild to think about.
It is, and those changes can have a huge impact on how we think, how we feel, and how we behave.
So it's not all doom and gloom then, is it? I mean, we're not just stuck with whatever neural pathways we've created, right?
Not at all. Think of it like this. Imagine a field of grass.
Okay.
If you walk the same path through that field every day, eventually you create a clear trail. That's kind of what's happening in our brain.
Uh-huh.
But the good news is, if you decide to start walking a different path, the old one will eventually start to fade.
So if we want to counteract the negative effects of social media, we can actually rewire our brains by creating new pathways, new habits, new ways of thinking.
Exactly. And that's where things like mindfulness, meditation, and spending time in nature can be so powerful. These activities have been shown to promote neuroplasticity and create positive changes in the brain. It's like giving our brains a much-needed break from the digital world. and allowing them to reconnect with the natural world.
It makes me think of hitting the refresh button on my brain, kind of like a digital detox for my mind.
That's a great analogy. And remember, it's not just about what we do offline, it's also about how we use social media itself. If we're mindful of the content we're consuming, if we're engaging in meaningful conversations, if we're using it to connect with people who inspire and support us, we're actually giving our brains positive experiences that can counteract the negative ones.
It seems like this idea of being intentional keeps coming up. Intentional about how we use social media, intentional about how we spend our time offline, intentional about what we expose our brains to.
It's about taking back control of our digital lives and using technology in a way that works for us, not the other way around.
Mhm.
We have more power than we realize.
That's really encouraging to hear. So to recap, we've talked about how social media affects our brains on so many levels, from our dopamine and attention to our sleep and even our face-to-face communication skills. And we've explored this amazing ability our brains have to change and adapt neuroplasticity.
We've covered a lot of ground. Now in the final part of our deep dive, let's get practical and talk about some strategies you can actually use to build a healthier relationship with social media. Stay with us. We'll be back in a flash.
All right, we're back for the final part of our deep dive into, this fascinating world of social media and its impact on our brains. And it's been quite a journey so far, right? We've explored how social media can be both beneficial and challenging. And we've even talked about how it can literally change the way our brains work. But now I think it's time to shift gears and really talk about what we can do about all of this. We've got all this knowledge, but how do we actually apply it to our lives to create a healthier relationship with social media?
Yeah, that's the key question,
Yeah.
right? It's one thing to understand the science, but it's another to actually change our behavior. And the good news is there are a lot of things we can do to take control.
Okay, that's what I want to hear. So, what are some strategies that our listeners can use to start making changes today?
Well, one of the most effective things you can do is set boundaries. Think about it like this. If you were trying to eat healthier, you wouldn't let yourself have unlimited access to junk food all day long, right?
Right.
You'd set some limits. It's the same with social media.
Okay, so how do we set boundaries with something that's designed to keep us engaged 24/7?
We'll start with small, specific goals.
Okay.
Maybe you decide to only check social media at certain times of the day. Or maybe you limit yourself to a certain number of platforms. You can even try designating certain areas of your home as no phone zones.
Oh, I love that idea. Creating some sacred spaces where our brains can get a break from the digital world.
Exactly. And remember those digital detoxes we talked about earlier.
Sure.
Those can be incredibly powerful for resetting your brain and reconnecting with yourself. And it doesn't have to be anything drastic. Even just a few hours unplugged can make a difference.
I've definitely noticed that when I take a break from social media, I feel, more present, more focused, and less anxious. It's like clearing out the mental clutter. So what about the content itself? We talked about how the constant stream of information can be really overwhelming.
Right? That's where being intentional with your feed comes in. Think about it like spring cleaning for your social media.
Okay.
Unfollow any accounts that trigger negative emotions
Yeah.
or make you feel inadequate. Seek out accounts that inspire you, educate you, or make you laugh. Remember, you have the power to curate your own online experience.
Yeah. And it's so easy to get caught up in that, negativity bias, that tendency to focus on the bad news and the drama. It's almost like we're drawn to it.
It's a natural human tendency.
Yeah.
But we can train ourselves to be more discerning about what we consume. Choose to fill your feed with things that uplift you and support your well-being.
I think it also helps to remember why we're using social media in the first place. Are we trying to connect with loved ones, stay informed about current events, build a business, or are we just mindlessly scrolling out of habit?
Yeah, and knowing your why can help you use social media more intentionally. It becomes a tool to help you achieve your goals, rather than a distraction that pulls you away from them.
So it all comes back to taking control. We have the power to choose how we interact with social media, how much time we spend on it, and what kind of impact it has on our lives.
You said it. The key is to remember that we are not passive consumers of technology. We are active participants in shaping our digital experience.
And I think that's a really empowering message. We're not helpless victims of the algorithms. We have choices, and we can create a digital world that supports our well-being.
Absolutely. And as we learn more about the brain and how it's affected by technology, we'll be even better equipped to make conscious, informed choices about how we use social media.
Well, I think that's a perfect note to end on. We've covered so much in this deep dive, from the science of dopamine loops and neuroplasticity to practical strategies for setting boundaries and curating our feeds.
It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope our listeners feel empowered to take what they've learned and create a more intentional and fulfilling relationship with social media.
Yeah, I agree. It's all about balance, awareness, and making choices that support your well-being. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep those brains engaged, and we'll see you next time.